everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Grab those reading glasses because it's time for Rock and Read. Today we will be reading part 2 of chapter 6 of White Line Fever by Lemmy. If you need a refresher, you should see a card for part 1 right about now. Part 2 is called Sex Pistols. Let's check it out. Around this time, I had hooked up with Ted Carroll from Chiswick Records. I asked Ted to bring a mobile studio down to the gig so we could document our farewell performance and our fans would have something to remember us by. Well, Ted apparently couldn't get the studio down to the marquee, but he did show up backstage after we played, and he made us an offer. If you want to make a single, I'll schedule you 2 days at Escape Studio in Kent. So we went down to Escape with producer Speedy Keen, who had been in a band called Thunderclap Newman, which had a #1 hit in England with the song Something in the Air. In 2 days, we recorded 11 backing tracks with no vocals. We all agreed that there was no point in doing a single because we wanted to at least leave an album as a memento. So we just barreled our way through an album's worth of material in 48 hours with no sleep. Speedy Keen and the engineer John Burns were speeding out of their heads because they couldn't afford to go to sleep. They didn't have the time and they wanted to make an album as much as we did. They mixed 24 versions of Motorhead alone. Then they asked me which one I liked the best, as if I would remember. I mean, you can't tell after 3. I just said, it. That one. At the end of the 2 days, Ted came down to hear 2 finished songs, and we gave him 11 unfinished ones. But as he was listening, he was doing the boogie at the back of the studio, so we knew we'd got him. He gave us a few more days to finish vocals and such, and Motorhead was our first album to see the light of day. By then, we had wrestled our freedom away from UA, so we were back in business. We recorded a total of 13 songs for Chiswick, and 8 of them wound up on the album. Much of Motorhead was material from On Parole, which we re-recorded. Motorhead, Vibrator, Lost Johnny, Iron Horse, Born to Lose, and The Watcher. We also did 2 new songs, White Line Fever and Keep Us on the Road, and a Johnny Burnett song, Train Kept A-Rollin'. You're probably familiar with Aerosmith's version of it. It was a hit for them. The other song that didn't wind up on the album included City Kids, which was a B-side for the Motorhead single, a ZZ Top song called Beer Drinkers and Hellraisers. I'm Your Witch Doctor, a great song by John Mayall and Eric Clapton, On Parole, and an instrumental jam which was appropriately called Instro. Those last 4 songs were released as the Beer Drinkers EP in 1980, long after we'd left Chiswick, and not so coincidentally near the peak of our success. Once again, it was cash-in time, for the record labels at least. I've never recorded more than we need since, but having said that, I don't begrudge Ted Carroll that. He saved my band after all. It was about this time that we started to have some differences with Secunda. For one thing, he wanted us to get our hair cut. Obviously, we weren't going to do that. Doug Smith started coming back into the picture when he put us on a tour through England with Hawkwind, whom he was still managing. That was in June of 1977, but with our usual bit of luck, Phil broke his hand in a fight on the day before the tour. We were all at my house painting our equipment, and this guy came over, a junkie who was a real drag. We told him to leave, but he wouldn't go. So Phil hustled him out the door and punched him. Unfortunately, this shoved Phil's knuckle back to about the center of his hand. So we ended up gaffer taping the drumstick to Phil's bandaged hand, and we did the whole tour that way. Other than that, it was a good tour, and things were fine between us and Hawkwind. Phil injured himself again a couple months later with more disastrous results. We had just started a headlining tour to promote the new album, which was due out in a few days, and we were even supported by a band called the Count Bishops, who were very good. We called it the Beyond the Threshold of Pain Tour, which should have given us a hint. Round about the 5th show, Phil got into an argument with Bobs, one of our roadies, over Motorcycle Irene. This time he broke his wrist instead of his knuckle, so we had to cancel the whole tour. Tony Secunda fired Bobs that night, but it wasn't really Bob's fault. It was unfortunate because Bobs had worked hard for us. He was actually going down to phone boxes with bags of 2 pence pieces and getting us gigs. But in the end, I guess it didn't matter. We had to wait for Phil's hand to heal before we did any more shows, and we were off stage until November when we did a show at the Marquee. During the first few months of 1978, nothing much was happening. The odd gig here and there, including one in Colwyn Bay near where I grew up, but that was about it. Tony Secunda had some sort of dispute with Chiswick and fired them. I believe it was also around this time that we parted ways with Tony. He bailed out and eventually went to work for Shelter Records in San Francisco. In 1995, he died. Rest in peace. This was a bleak period for us. It seemed like we couldn't even get arrested. Our lack of forward motion was getting to Eddie and Phil once again, so they went off and did some shows with Speedy Keen and a bassist, Billy Rath, who had played with Johnny Thunders and the Heartbreakers and Iggy Pop. They called themselves the Muggers. I think Speedy wanted to form a band with them permanently, and he might have been successful because we were about to break up. But finally, Doug Smith took us back and got us to deal with Bronze Records, who had bands like Uriah Heep and the Bonzo Dog Doodah Band on its roster. It was just for a single. They wanted to see how it did before they invested any more money in us. But it turned out to be the beginning of our long-awaited upward ascent. Not only did the Bronze deal give us a shot in the arm, we would have our biggest hits with the label. And really, they treated us quite well there. Not that we appreciated it at the time. In fact, we found a lot to gripe about. We thought Bronze gave us a hard time, but considering the dealings I've had with record companies since, they were great. Since then, I've often looked back on the Bronze days with nostalgia. The label head, Jerry Braun, and his wife Lillian were really enthusiastic about us, and A&R exec Howard Thompson, who was the one responsible for signing us, was brilliant. They believed in us and made some good efforts on our behalf. So that summer we went into Wessex Studios in London and recorded Louie Louie with one of our own numbers, Tear You Down, as a B-side. Covering Louie Louie was an idea Phil had come up with some months back when we were still with Tony Secunda. We had been sifting through some old songs, and I wanted to cover a Chuck Berry song, Bye Bye Johnny, or something like that. But Louie Louie was the better choice, really. I think we did a very good version of it. People tell me that it's one of the few times it's been recorded where the lyrics can be understood. Actually, I only got the first two verses, and then the last verse was largely improvised. We produced it jointly with this guy Neil Richmond. We never did work with him again, but he was good, except for that weird clav-a-line thing he put in. I thought that was suspicious. We used to call him Neil Fishface. I don't recall why, because he didn't really have a fish face. Well, only from certain angles. Anyhow, the single was released on August 25th, 1978. The photograph of us on the sleeve, incidentally, was shot by Motorcycle Irene. By the end of September, it had gone up to number 68 in the charts, which was good enough for Bronze to give us the go-ahead for a full album. As it was making its move up the charts, we started a tour around England, but before we took off, I had my brief excursion with The Damned. In America, The Damned was never more than a good-sized cult band, but in England, they were much more famous. They were the true punk band, not the Sex Pistols. The Pistols were a great rock and roll band, but really, that's all they were. I actually gave Sid Vicious some bass lessons. He came up to me and said, "Hey, Lemmy, teach me how to play bass." And I said, "All right, Sid." But after 3 days, I had to tell him, "Sid, you can't play bass." He said, "Yeah, I know." And he was all depressed and went off. Then a couple months later, I saw him down at the Speakeasy, and he said, "Hey, Lemmy, guess what? I'm in the Pistols." "What do you mean?" I said. "I'm the bass player in the Pistols," he said. "It's great, isn't it?" "You can't play bass, Sid." Yeah, I know. But I'm in the Pistols." Steve Jones just taught him the basic bum, 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 bum. That's all he had to do, really. Anything more complex than that on the album, it's either Steve or Glenn Matlock. Sid, he wanted to be in a punk band so bad. He had been in a band called Flowers of Romance for about 3 weeks, then Suixi and the Banshees for about 3 days. He just talked everybody into it. But he was very good for the image. He was perfect. He out-pistoled the Pistols as far as the image was concerned. Even though he couldn't play bass worth a damn, Sid was a nice enough geezer. I got quite friendly with him, but we used to get into all sorts of fights. One night at the Marquee, he mixed it with Bruce Foxton, the bass player, out of the jam, and Bruce stuck a broken glass in his face. I was walking down Warder Street toward the speakeasy, and the lights were still on at the Marquee, so I put my head in there. You might find some birds, and there was Bruce going, "Me," and all this. I said, "What's up?" And he said, "I just glass Sid. I think I cut him." I said, "Well, I'm sure you cut him, else he'd still be here jumping on you." He was worried that he'd hurt him bad, so I went to the speak. There used to be all these cinema seats in the front of the stage for a while, and Sid was sitting right there in the middle of them, all on his own. So I went over to him and said, "What's up, Sid?" "Done me," he said, and he had this three-cornered wound going right through his cheek. "You wait till I get better," he promised, but he never did try and do Bruce again. One time he was trying to take a bird into the toilet for something or another, and this huge Maltese bouncer, who was a really hard man, said, "You can't go in there." And Sid just went for him. I'd never seen anything like it. The geezer was down on the deck, rolling backwards on his elbows up the stairs, horrified, because this bundle of pipe cleaners and a pair of tennis shoes was kicking the out of him. The guy didn't even know what to make of it. Sid frightened him to death. Anyway, that was the punk era for you. So, I liked the Pistols, though as I said, I thought they were really a rock and roll band. And I never liked the Clash for that matter. Joe Strummer was better than the 101ers, the band he had before the Clash. When it came to punk, the Damned were the real thing. They never quite got it together, but they were great fun. Dave Vanian couldn't sing, none of the guitar players could play, and the drummer, Rat Scabies, just sort of went along with it all. But they were crazy. I mean, seriously in need of professional help. One time we supported them at the Roundhouse with the adverts, and at the start of their show, Captain Sensible, that's a true maniac for you, came out wearing a pink ballet tutu, fishnet stockings, a pair of hobnailed boots, these big wing-tip shades, and orange hair, and all the punks spat on him. And by the end of the gig, the band was skating around in this green goop all over the stage. They were soaked in it, and then the captain took all his clothes off. Of course, he used to do that at most of the gigs. When they played at another London club, the Rainbow, he peed on the front row. The audience was throwing seats at him, and he was throwing them back while peeing down his leg. I hasten to add, just your typical mid-70s punk show, and then some. Anyhow, I got to know them over the years. I met Rat at Dingwall's. I was at the bar, and this over-scruffy urchin came up behind me and said, "Hey, you're Lemmy, aren't you?" So I replied, "Yeah, I am." "Yeah? You think you're a rock star or something?" Little inquired. "No," I said, "but you do. That's why you're talking to me." "Fair enough," he shrugged. "I'll buy you a drink." The Damned went out of business for a while after Brian James left the band. Then, when they reformed, the captain wanted to play guitar. It was probably his idea to ask me to fill in on bass for a gig at London's Electric Ballroom. They were calling themselves the Doomed for that show, but they returned to being the Damned shortly thereafter. We had about 5 hours of rehearsal. I learned 11 of their songs, and they learned one of mine, which they wound up on stage. I shouldn't have even bothered having them do one of my songs, really. But it was fun playing with those boys. So much fun, in fact, that Eddie, Phil, and I wound up doing a recording session with them, too. We recorded a couple of songs, a version of the Sweets' Ballroom Blitz, and a Motorhead tune, Over the Top. That was a joke. The captain was watching cricket on TV and wouldn't come out of the TV room for starters, and Eddie and Phil were fighting, as usual. Dave Vanian showed up late, and by then we were all drunk as... He took one look at us all, spun on his heel, and walked straight back out. In the end, only me and the damn bassist Augie Ward were still alive, so to speak, so we just went in and around. I did a bass solo on Ballroom Blitz, and he did the vocals. That song wound up as a B-side to the Damned single, I just can't be happy today, but we had a rough mix that was much better than the one that appeared on the record. We never did get around to putting vocals on Over the Top. Oh yeah, and we broke the toilet bowl at the studio too. I think the captain kicked it in. But back to motor business. We toured through September and October, and on October 24th we filmed our first Top of the Pops appearance. Top of the Pops is a terrible program, really. They had bands on the show who were either in the top 30 like Slade and the Nolan Sisters. I did a record with those innocent little once. More on that later. Or who the program thought was headed for the top 30. There was no regard to anything like talent. It was just reflecting the charts. We weren't anywhere near reaching the top 30 at the time. Louie Louie had peaked at 68. But this friend of ours who worked at Bronze, Roger Bolton, used to work for the BBC, so he had a lot of handy influence. Roger wound up getting us on the show about 5 times before we really had a hit. In fact, Roger's efforts on our behalf helped us quite a bit on our way up the charts, for which I will buy him a drink any time. So we went down to the Labyrinth BBC studios to tape our appearance. It's like a rat's nest in there. Hundreds of studios and corridors, and you need a guide to take you to the studio. It's lunacy. Someday all the guides are going to be ill and everybody's going to be... We were supposed to re-record the song, but no one ever did. We just used to remix the original tracks slightly, put the vocals up a bit higher or something. Then we put our amps up, lean the guitars on them, and turn everything on. Then the inspector from the BBC would come round to the studio to make sure you'd done the work. He knew what was going on, of course, and we knew that he knew. It was all a game. Tactic agreement, we'd call it. At least we really played on our records instead of having studio musicians like a lot of pop stars did. The Top of the Pops people treated us all right, but it was only because they had to. I don't think they liked us much really, especially because I won money on the one-armed bandit that was in their canteen. That pissed off everybody from the BBC, because they'd been waiting for it to pay off. By this time, we had already worked up several songs for the upcoming album, played them on stage, and we were looking for a producer. We wound up getting Jimmy Miller, who had produced Exile on Main Street and Goat's Head Soup for the Rolling Stones, though things were really starting to look up for us. Our years of struggling were paying off, and by now, Phil and Eddie had stopped complaining about lack of momentum. That doesn't mean they'd stop complaining, however. The kicker was in November, when we headlined the Hammersmith Odon, the same place where Blue Oyster Cult had so soundly us over 3 years earlier. It was fully packed with 3,000 fans cheering us on. You could feel the energy. Our rise up the rock star food chain had begun. Well, that's the end of part 2. Let me know what you thought of part 2 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.